Want to follow along as I replace the factory sound and lights in this Athearn model? Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Welcome to DCC Shop. In this episode, I'm going to install a Loksound DCC sound decoder into an HO scale Athearn GP40P-2 locomotive. Now you may be wondering why I'm doing that since this locomotive already has a Tsunami DCC sound decoder in it, and the simple answer is I prefer Loksound. This is an Athearn Southern Pacific GP40P-2 in HO scale. This one actually came with a Tsunami 2 sound decoder in it already, but I want to change that to a Loksound, and I also want to improve the lighting. So before I continue with the install, I just wanted to tell a little personal story about 3197. It was painted in the bicentennial colors, and I first saw it running up and down the peninsula probably around 1975 when it went into service. In fact, my grandmother actually took me down to the Hillsdale train station in San Mateo, California, which is, if you're not familiar, San Mateo's roughly about halfway between San Francisco and San Jose. Anyway, I don't know how she knew that the engine was going to be there, but we went down there and we saw a freight train, and then a while later 3197 came by pulling a commute train, and I thought it was really cool, you know, because I was used to seeing the scarlet and gray all the time, and to see an engine painted in something different was pretty neat. So I'll always have that memory. Unfortunately, I was too young to have photos, but it is something that, you know, makes this engine kind of special to me. So that's kind of why I wanted to do this one. When I'm working on an engine, I like to put it in one of these foam cradles to protect the details. However, you have to be careful of the sunshades when you do that, because these can get hung up on this foam. So I like to spread the cradle when I put the engine in or take it out so that these don't get bent too much, because if you flex them around too much, they can break off. As with most diesels, you have to remove the couplers to get the shell off. Sometimes the screws are stubborn. Part of the plastic draft gearbox actually stuck in here, so I'm going to have to coax it out with a little screwdriver. It's a pretty tight fit. There it goes. So this is kind of a tight fit, but with some coaxing the shell will come off. There we go. So here's the Tsunami sound decoder, speaker, and then there's wires going up to the lights in the shell, which are bulbs. So I definitely want to get rid of the bulbs, and I want to get rid of this. It'll be a little easier to get all the connections off the decoder if I take the decoder out, or at least loosen it. They're held in with a couple of clips, typically, these board-style decoders. There's one here and typically one on this side. Just fit in the little slots. So it's just that easy to loosen it. Most of the wires are held on with clips instead of being soldered. And there's not a lot of slack in the track power wires, so I'm going to have to take those off carefully. That's as far as it goes. I flipped it around to make it a little easier to see. The speaker wire is attached on the other side with more clips. And the motor wires too. And now, yeah, the decoder's separate from the frame. So I'm not too concerned about saving the bulbs. I'm just going to pull them out. They're really just held in with tape and a little bit of glue, and usually they come out pretty easily. So now I have all the wires removed from the shell. Now to put in new lights, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll take the cab off. However, there's a lot of detail, especially this little conduit up here and this little thing, and I don't really see a good way to do this without risking a lot of damage. So I'm going to try, if I can, to do the whole thing without removing the cab and just leaving the shell intact. So one of the things I want to do is to light up the number boards. And 3197 and some of the other commute engines actually sometimes carried train numbers instead of the unit number up here. Oh, there it goes. That actually just fell out. Okay, that wasn't too hard. Let's see if I can get the other side. I'm just trying to grab the edge of it with my fingernail. This one, oh, there it goes. Okay, yeah. They're just glued in with a very not so great kind of glue. So it's not too hard to get them loose most of the time. I also want to see if I can pry out the lens for the emergency light. See it moving. There it goes. If you wanted to save the little red lens, you could. I'll probably end up making a new one, so I'm not too worried about it, but I'll go ahead and put it in a box with the other parts. I also happen to have a model of 3199, which is identical to 3197 except for the paint job. I'm going to be working on both engines at the same time, but I'm only going to show steps on 3197 unless there's something different about the other one. The biggest difference between these two as far as the chassis go is that 3199 was the DCC ready one and it didn't have a speaker, so it just has this big weight back here, whereas 3197 already had the speaker installed. Now I've already installed a Loksound decoder in this one, although I don't have a speaker for it yet, so this engine is a little bit ahead of 3197 at this point, but I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same thing to this one in a little bit. This next part isn't strictly necessary for the DCC install, but I want to paint the wheel faces on the trucks, and it's just easier to do that when you have the model taken apart anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this piece off the frame here. There's 2 screws. Just pull this, there, pull it up and pull the wires out. That makes it easier to access the cover over the worm because I'm going to have to remove that to take the truck off. Just to make sure I don't lose anything, I'm going to take the 2 screws from that part, put them in some tape, and then tape them to the part and put this in my box of parts that I'm keeping. I'm going to remove the speaker mount as well since it kind of blocks access to the rear gear tower. Now that those parts are out of the way, I can use a small flat-bladed screwdriver and pry up the worm gear cover. And I can remove the worm. And now the truck will just fall out. Normally I'd be inclined to label which drive shaft is which, but the rear one is so much longer that it's pretty obvious. So I'm going to be working with the trucks first, but I have to be careful because these sander lines on the chassis extend down below the level of the fuel tank. So when I store this, I'm going to put something under the fuel tank to raise the whole thing up, and that way there won't be any pressure on these delicate parts. So the front truck has a speed recorder cable on it, but I'm just going to mark it with a paint pen just to make sure I don't mix up any of the parts. So these trucks have little clips that hold the bottom cover plate on. You kind of have to wedge them apart, and it's difficult, can be difficult because they'll tend to snap back together. I undid both on one side, which allows me to tilt the cover a little bit, and then I can get the other side. Maybe. Just got to catch the little tab under the screwdriver and lift it. All right, I had to use a smaller screwdriver and do that off camera, but once it's done, the cover plate will come off. So now the side frame should come apart. It kind of takes a little wiggling sometimes if they're a little tight. They will eventually come loose, but I don't like to force them because I don't want to damage anything. There's one. There, okay. So this is a good time also to inspect the trucks for excess lubrication. It looks like Athearn did a pretty good job on these. It looks like they used a white grease, which is what I'd normally use in these engines anyway. And they didn't use, huge gobs of it. So I think I'm going to leave that alone. I don't think I need to clean these. They seem to be rolling pretty well. With the truck in this condition, the axles will just lift right out. There's nothing holding them anymore. Now I'm going to clean the wheel faces with some isopropyl alcohol. And I'm going to do one axle at a time just to make sure I don't mix anything up, although they are pretty much interchangeable, so if I did put them back in a different order, I don't think it would make any difference really. I'm going to paint the wheel faces with some Model Master Railroad Tie Brown, but you could really use any brownish color. It doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to use a brush. I have seen painting fixtures that people use to airbrush wheels. That's another option. Although I found if you clean the wheels really well, with the isopropyl alcohol, then brushing the paint on works fine and it doesn't flake off later. So when you're doing this, it's important to try to keep the paint off of this little circle in the center, because that's where the tip of the axle contacts the copper wipers inside the side frames, and that's part of the electrical path, so you don't want to have anything there. I try to keep paint off the wheel treads too, but I'm less concerned about that because those are a little easier to clean. I like to weather in layers, so the next step is to use some Bragdon self-adhesive weathering powder. I like this stuff because it'll stick and won't rub off or fall off, once you've applied it. So I'll use a microbrush to just rub some of this around the wheel face. One thing I've noticed with looking at real train wheels is that they're not really all one color. If you look at them really closely, it's a lot of different shades of brown and earth tones, typically, maybe some grease and stuff too. So I think the layering helps to reproduce that. You can also spin the wheel and just let the brush stay still. That can help to distribute the powder a little more evenly sometimes. Next, I'm going to use some Neolube number 2, which is a graphite lubricant. It helps with electrical conductivity. I'm using a different microbrush to apply some Neolube to the axle center. I'm also going to put some Neolube into the bearings on the copper or brass pieces that are inside the side frames. They actually look more like brass than copper. It's kind of interesting choice there. I noticed one of the brake lines on the rear truck is loose. The rest of them are glued up here, but this one is not. So I'm going to try to fix that. So I'm using a number 76 bit to drill a small hole in the top of the side frame. The brake line actually has a little bend in it, so the bend should fit into the hole. That should help to keep it stable. Yeah, that worked. The brake line's now secured, and I think once the truck is back together and the engine is reassembled, you won't even see that. Before putting the trucks back together, I like to check the wheel gauge just to make sure these are fine, but it's good to check it when it's apart because it's easier to fix. So reassembling the truck is just the opposite of taking it apart. You just have to be careful that the axles go into the little holes in the metal pieces in the side, and then you should just be able to push it together. And once it's together, the cover plate should just snap back in place. It's good to check to make sure that the trucks roll well. This is pretty good. I should mention that the wires come off the side frame near the gear tower, so the left and right sides are different because they're both toward the gear tower, and then the wire wraps around this little post. This post has a slot in it on the side with the gear, and the wire kind of is supposed to loop around that. It's just a retainer clip basically, but it's important to put that back the way it was. The last step is to use a wire brush attachment in my motor tool to clean the wheel treads, and I do this at a slight angle so that the motor tool is spinning away from the wheel face. That way I don't scour paint from the wheel faces. So I've reattached the trucks to the chassis. So the tricky part about putting this front piece of metal back onto the frame is that this kind of sandwiches the wires in these little channels, and the wires also have to go through these two little holes up here. So I'm going to have to do this off camera because this is way too fussy, but you just got to make sure that each wire goes through one hole, and then they are in here but not being crushed. They should be sandwiched inside the channel, in other words, but not being crushed between the two pieces of metal. All right, so that took a little fiddling. If you've done it right, you should be able to pull on the wires and see them move a little bit. That way you know that they're not crushed in there. So I can see the top piece of wire moving as I move this bottom one. There should also be enough slack in the front that the truck can swivel side to side without binding. The rear is a little easier because the wires just go through this channel under the speaker area. I'm going to leave the speaker off for now though, because I want to make sure that I know which wire is which. I'm going to use the Loksound 58921 decoder for this model. It's a board style sound decoder with built-in capacitors. This decoder is actually a two-piece design. There's the adapter board with the capacitors, and then the actual decoder is this little thing right here. And there's a connector that plugs the two together. So this is kind of cool because Basically, this is like having an adapter board in the model, so you can do all of your wiring, make all your connections on here, and then in theory, at least in the future, if they come out with a Loksound 6 or something like that, you should be able to just replace this piece, I would think, and not the entire thing, and not have to do all your wiring over again. So for this decoder, because it has so many solder pads, I find it very helpful that they include a larger than life-size schematic drawing, and it labels all of these things and tells you what they do. So I refer to this all the time when I'm actually doing the wiring, because otherwise it's kind of hard sometimes to read what's printed on the decoder board itself. So it's much easier to refer to the diagram. The motor has 2 clips on top, and the decoder has 2 slots, and it should fit over those. Might take a little, there, fiddling to get it in. Now sometimes I've noticed that this will pop up, but I'll fix that later. For now though, it's in there good enough that I can do the wiring. So using the diagram, it's helpful to figure out that most of the solder pads should go on the left side of the engine. That puts the solder pads for the front headlight up here in the front, and for the rear headlight back in the back. Otherwise, I mean, you could put it in backwards, but you'd have to be running wires longer distances is really the only thing. But I just like to do it this way because I think it's just a little easier. So one thing about this is these front truck wires are a little bit short. The pad's like right here, and the wire's just, and I could probably stretch it and make it work, but I don't want to do that. So I'm going to end up splicing a short length of wire here. If the trucks had clips instead of having these soldered on, I might have just replaced the wires, but I'm just working with what's there. So it's not a big deal, but I'll just have to splice a little wire onto here to get it over here. I had to do the same thing with 3199. I may have to do the same thing in the back because these wires are just, they could maybe reach, but they're going to be pretty tight. So I think I managed to make it work on 3199, but I think on this model they're maybe just a little bit shorter. So I think I'm going to go ahead and splice these as well. These are stranded wires, so I like to take them and twist the strands together before I solder. I think it just helps to keep the strands from fraying, and you don't want any little stray strands sticking out somewhere. I like to tin the wires before I do anything else, and I'll cut them a little shorter. Tin the solder pads for the motor, then I can start making the connections. I've already determined that the red wire goes to the forward motor solder pad after doing 3199's chassis. So I usually splice wires by tinning both wires and then just heating them and letting the solder stick them together. I put some heat shrink tubing over the splice. This is a very small, I think it's 1/16 size. And I heat it, and that'll keep it insulated. Alright, so now I've spliced all the track power wires and soldered them to the appropriate pads on the decoder. Athearn didn't color code the left and right sides, which is why I wanted to do this before I put the speaker back on, so I made sure not to mix these up. I was looking at these wires, and I'm pretty sure the way they had it before was the wires were under here and then the speaker goes over that. I don't really like that though, because it puts the wires really close to the drive line, and if the wires rub on the flywheel or on the drive shaft, it can make noise, unwanted noise, not the good kind of noise you're trying to get out of your sound decoder. So I want to try to figure out something else for this. It would have been better if I'd thought of this before I put everything back together. So I've done some masking to try to keep metal shavings out of the sensitive parts of the mechanism in the decoder. But what I want to do is cut a little channel for the wires on either side of this metal piece right here. I removed the fuel tank just to get it out of the way while I'm working on the engine. So I cut a groove on both sides, and the wires will now fit in there. And that should keep them out of the way of the drive line. Now I can reattach the speaker. I used some Kapton tape to secure the wires. If you're not familiar, it's a very thin insulating tape. It's a lot thinner than regular electrical tape, so it won't interfere with the shell going back on the frame. I shortened the speaker wires a little bit and then soldered them to the appropriate pads on the decoder. This engine is now together enough that I can get it on the programming track and get the sounds programmed into it. For $31.99, I'm going to use this Loksound 50321 speaker. Inside is a Sugar Cube style 8-ohm speaker and then a multi-part enclosure kit. This is the same speaker I used on the Kato NW2 that I did in a previous DCC shop episode, and I really liked it. So I'm hoping it works out well in $31.99 also. When you put everything together, you end up with something that looks like this. There's a couple of different ways you can assemble it, but I used all the parts to make the enclosure as big as possible. The only thing I'm doing a little bit differently, or at least something they don't really tell you to do, is I'm just using a little bit of silicone to seal up this gap that goes down the middle, just to eliminate any air leaks. It can make a big difference with the sound. I can't stress enough how important an enclosure is to having good sound out of a speaker. It makes a huge difference. The speaker is narrow enough to easily fit inside the shell, so what I need to do is to cut down a little space on the weight so that I can put the speaker in there. I used a pencil to draw some cut lines on this weight so I can make room for the speaker. I used a hacksaw, my motor tool, and some files to remove the material from this weight. It's not pretty, but I think it'll work. I mounted the speaker and enclosure with some double-sided foam tape, and even with the thickness of the tape, the speaker still fits well within the original profile of the weight, so there shouldn't be any clearance issues inside the model. Okay, I've wired in the speaker, and looks like this is going to work out pretty well. Okay, so now both chassis are pretty much in the same condition. Different speakers, but other than that, they're pretty much the same. First, I'll need to find an appropriate sound set. The Loksound website has so many sounds for the Loksound 5 that sometimes it's easier to use the search feature. I'll type in GP40-2. As you can see, there's a bunch of options that come up. To be honest, I'm not sure exactly which one would be best for this model. All of these are for different variations of the EMD 645 prime mover used in GP40-2s and SD40-2s. I decided I'm going to use set SO845. If you click the link that says more, there's a bunch of information about which locomotives this set will work for, what horn sounds it has, bells, and all kinds of other stuff. I'm putting the model on my multi-gauge programming track. If you want to know how I built this, there's a DCC shop video about it here on the channel. Let's give them a little test. Now I haven't picked a horn or anything, this is pretty much just the default sounds. But it's making noise and it's running. Let's try this one. So at this point, both of the chassis are running and they're making noise. I'm going to leave it here for now. Next time I'll pick it up and install the lights into the shell and put everything back together. If you like this video, then please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned and thanks for watching.